change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
So last week, we last left David and his men on their 75-mile march to Aphek, now being a part of the Philistine army enlisted by King Achish to fight against Israel. And then we left King Saul walking 6 miles back to Gilboa late at night after a disappointing night with a witch at Endor, knowing that Israel will lose, where he and his sons will die in the battle. And so now, starting in chapter 29, we flash back to David and his men, where they had just finished that 75-mile march from Ziklag to Aphek. And the Philistine army, they're all lined up in the Jezreel Valley, which is the same valley that we know as Armageddon. And to picture this, it would be like picturing one of those old movie clips where the Russians are all marching in line and in ranks and standing at attention, showing their commanders how strong their army is. And here, they're all passing by the lords of the Philistines. And this is a lot of men. This is groups of hundreds and thousands. And at the end of this long line of troops, there's this group that doesn't quite look like the rest, who are obviously not Philistines, because they're dressed differently, because they're Hebrews. They're dressed more like shepherds. And they're bringing up the rear guard to protect King Achish. And the Lord of the Philistines, they ask Achish, they say, what are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish, he defends David and his men, because Achish, he's found no fault with David in the past 16 months that David's been with him. And that's because David has been lying to Achish. But all these princes of the Philistines, they're mad at Achish, and they tell Achish to send these fellows back to their homes, which is generous of them, because they could have killed them on the spot and not fooled with them, because they remember what happened in that big first battle against Saul up in Geba, where there were these Hebrews that had joined them, that had defected, joined to fight them, where in the middle of the battle, they switched back to fight for Israel. And the Philistines, they lost that battle. And that's what they're thinking that David and his men could do, that David would be able to make peace with Saul by the heads of the Philistines. And all these guys, they have all heard that song about David killing his 10,000s. And that song, it had already been out now for 10 years because it really was a good song. And so it got a lot of play. And so Achish, he calls David to send him and his men away. And what's funny here is that Achish, he swears by the Lord to David. He doesn't swear by his Philistine gods. And maybe this is just out of consideration to David. And then Achish tells David that he finds no fault with David, but that he can't offend the Philistine lords. And so then David, he puts up this big fuss and he acts all hurt, and that he was actually looking forward to killing a bunch of Hebrews, the king's enemies. And then some people think that David is actually being sincere here, but I don't think so. I'd have a hard time believing that. I just think that David is a great actor and that he's always been able to get one over on King Achish ever since their beginning 10 years ago, when David pretended to be a madman. Because David is a very believable liar. He's the kind of guy that could win Academy Awards. And though David is very backslidden here and living the life of a Philistine, I don't think David has fallen that far to kill his own people. I believe this whole incident is just God getting David out of the pickle that he got himself into. But if it is true, if David has come to this new low where David has gotten himself about as far from God's will for his life as he could, And then in verse 7, Achish tells David, go in peace, which is much more than just a goodbye. This is actually Achish releasing David from any further obligation to him. So David now is no longer Achish's vassal. And so the men, they're ordered to leave at the first morning light. So now, having escaped going to war against Israel, or even being put in the position to have to decide what to do, they begin their 75-mile, 3-day journey to Ziklag. And we're told here that it took them 3 days, and that would be 25 miles a day on average. And this is very difficult terrain. But you can imagine the relief that they felt, that they maybe had this sense of joy because they're all going home. They're going to be able to sleep in their own beds and be with their families. And so they had to have been getting more excited the closer they got to home, where they would have gotten so close, they would be expecting somebody to come out to greet them because their families, they would have been keeping an eye out for them. But as they get closer, instead of seeing loved ones, they would begin to smell the stench of where a fire had burned. And then they would come close enough to see the smoldering smoke. And then they would rush in and they would see everything burned, all their homes and everything gone with nothing left. Everything they had built through all these years with David, lost, nothing to show for it, where all you have left is just the clothes on your back, not knowing what happened to your wife or to your children. Did they kill them? Are they slaves, or is it worse? Are any of them still alive? There's a lot they don't know. And if it was the Amalekites, they would have not only wanted to have taken their possessions, but they would have wanted vengeance because of what David and his men did to them. Because when they were raiding Amalekite cities, they didn't just take everything, they killed everyone. And just looking at this naturally, this would be payback. What goes around comes around. So if you're going to act like a raiding bunch of Philistines, and if that's what you sow, this is what you should expect to reap. Because for the last 16 months, David, you decided to leave God's will for your life. And this is what it looks like being out of God's will. Outside of God's will, there's only going to be loss and disappointments. And that's what it's like to be backslidden when you go back to the world because God's will seems to be too hard for you and thinking God has let you down in the fulfilling of his promises for your life. And where now it takes a strong blow from God to wake you up and to bring you back. And these are great losses that wake you up to bring you back to God. And that blow, it doesn't actually have to come from God because really what you're doing is you're just really reaping what you sowed. And so all these men who are alongside David here, they've never lost a battle before while being led by David. And now they've lost everything. And the verb that's used in verse 2 that says, they did not kill anyone, but carried them away. Well, what that literally means is that they drove them off like animals, like how herdsmen drive cattle. But actually, the Amalekites were more merciful here than David was, because when David raided Amalekite encampments, David didn't leave anyone alive. And so David's men, who are all warriors, who are all big men in the peak of their physical condition, men who have seen the atrocities of war and the greatest of tragedies, they all start crying and wailing over the loss of their families, seeing their homes burned to ashes. And I don't know if you've ever seen big men cry. I haven't seen it very often. But I'll tell you, it's the last thing that any man would ever want to do publicly. And with these men, it says, they lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David here, he's grieving himself because he also lost 2 wives, along with everything he owns. So he's weeping too. And it says that David, he's greatly distressed. And that term, greatly distressed, is the same term that's used for a potter to press clay into a mold with a forced pressure. So David here, he's under a lot of pressure. So now with the loss of everything built for the last 16 months while living like a Philistine, it's all gone with nothing to show for the effort. And besides losing his family and his possession, David, he's lost his reputation. But David, he also loses his friends because these 600 men are his only friends in the whole world. And now they turn on him and they want to take his life with their own hands and stone him to death because David is the one who is responsible for their misery. And David knows that he's the one responsible. And so these men, they're hating David in the same way that they hated Saul for what Saul did to their lives. And now they're hating David in that same way. And they're thinking, how stupid can you be, David, aligning us up with the Philistines? You're an idiot. You make us leave our families and to leave our homes all unprotected while we're forced to go and fight in a Philistine army. How could you be so dumb? We really ought to kill you. And this is the second time in David's life where he's lost everything he had. But the first time it wasn't his fault. The first time it was Saul's fault, where he ended up all alone at that cave in Adullam. But this time, it's all David's fault. And this time, he's all alone again, even though he's around 600 men. And so this is as low as a man can go. This is rock bottom. This is greatly distressed. But now being alone, with no one to turn to, David strengthens himself in the Lord. And this is how much it took for David to repent. And to repent here, it's not a bad word because this is not about feeling shame. All this means is to turn toward God. And David, he hasn't turned toward God for the whole 16 months he was in Ziklag. And he hasn't called on God even once, for all we know, because you do not call on God when you're in rebellion. And David was in rebellion. But as soon as David does call on God, God receives him. And God doesn't even rebuke him. And we don't see God here even being angry at David. And that's because God's been waiting for him to come back. Because God here is just like the father from the parable of the prodigal son, that story that Jesus told, where the father is just waiting for the son to come to his senses. And then when the father sees the son coming, then the father runs to him. So here, David is returning, and he's returning to this simple walk of obedience. And he's saying to God, if you will speak to me, I will obey you. And so after David prays, he calls for Abiathar, the priest, to bring the ephod to inquire of the Lord. And I would think that most people having these kinds of losses, that they wouldn't take time to seek the Lord. I would think that these 600 men who had lost everything they owned, that they wouldn't want to wait to hear God, that they would just want to start trying to track down those Amalekites to get their revenge, to see if anyone's left alive. But David, he waits to hear what God will say to him, because David is tired of his own will. And so he waits for instruction. He's done making his own plans. And so David asks the Lord, should I pursue them? And then he asks, will I overtake them? And God, he doesn't only just tell David that he'll overtake them, but that he will recover everything that he and his men have lost. So God gives David his promise here to restore everything. And this is the first word of encouragement that these men have heard, because they had no idea up until now that their families were still alive, but now they know. And so they go. And it doesn't say that God told them which way to go, They just went believing that God would direct them as they go. And so they get to the brook Besor, which is 15 miles away from Ziklag. And 200 of the men, they couldn't take another step. They all wanted to go, but physically they couldn't go. And that's because they had just traveled 75 miles from Aphek to Ziklag, which was a hard pace for a 3-day journey through this difficult terrain. And then they had wept until they could weep no more, until they had no strength left. And so now you add 15 miles more to get to the brook, and then you try to cross the brook. They have nothing left to do it with. And so they have to tell David. And it's not that these 200 men aren't very strong. They're strong, but the other men are stronger. And this word weary that's used here for these 200 men, it's the word for a dead carcass, which literally means that they are dead tired. And David, he couldn't be excited about leaving 1/3 of his army behind. But David, he went on because he has a promise from God. And so here, David has stopped looking at God through his circumstances. And now he's looking at his circumstances through the eyes of God. So he's found his faith again, and he's found courage. So with 400 men, David travels on, still with no idea where they're going, but they're going on in faith that God will lead them. And then they come across a man who's been discarded to die, who's lying in a field dying. And it would have been easy just to keep going because they needed to catch up to those Amalekites who are still very far ahead of them. And I would guess that most, if not all the 400 men would be thinking, we don't have time to waste with this dying man. We need to save our own people, our own families. We can't waste time here with them. But someone brings the man to David. And David has compassion on him because this man's so weak and he can't just let him die there without doing anything. So David stops and the 400 men stop and they all wait. And David gives the man bread and then he makes him to drink water. And then he gives him a piece of cake and 2 clusters of raisins. And all those 400 men, all they could do here is wait and watch this man eat and drink. And at this time, David, he doesn't know a thing about him. He doesn't even know that he's an Egyptian. And when the man's strength came back, that's when David started to ask him who he was. And the man told him, he goes, I'm an Egyptian slave belonging to an Amalekite who had left him to die when he fell sick. And that he was with the Amalekites on their raids. And then he names all the different areas in Judah that they raided. And then he says, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And so this Egyptian slave, he also burned Ziklag, and he was there, and he was a participant. And so you would think that David's attitude, it would have changed toward the man. But David asks, and he says, can you take me down to this troop? And the Egyptian says, if you don't kill me, because they probably all wanted to kill him, because he's one of the ones that burned their homes. And the Egyptian says, and if you don't deliver me to my master, because his master, he would have definitely killed him for taking them down to where they camped. And so you have to see here, if David, if he had just passed by this man who was weaker than himself, a man in greater need than himself, without doing anything, then he would have passed by God's provision for God directing David to where they needed to go. And if David, if he had not shown him just a simple mercy with a little kindness, just a little food and a little water, David would have missed God's leading them to the Amalekites, because this was all put together by God's sovereignty, that God had placed this man in that field 3 days before they ever passed by. And God did it by allowing this man to get sick, because this man was David's roadmap. He was to lead David to the Amalekites. And it's often when we show mercy, that's when we receive God's mercy. And this is where you see that David, he's very much like Jesus Christ, putting others' needs above his own needs. And it's never because they deserve it. That Egyptian man, he didn't deserve it, but it's because they're weak and that they need it, though they don't have anything to offer you in return, or at least you don't think they have anything, because David, he didn't know he had anything to offer. For all David knew at the time, he was just a dying slave. And so being led now by the Egyptian slave, David and his men, they surprise the Amalekites during their dance party, where the Amalekites they're celebrating a little bit too early and they're drinking a little bit too much. And they're thinking that all those Hebrews are up in the valley of Jezreel, which is about 100 miles north of where they are, and that they're all fighting alongside with Achish and the Philistines. And so they fought them from twilight to the next evening, which is about 24 hours. But some people, they think this is a bad translation, that it should be from dawn to evening. And God, he gives David and the 400 men a great victory with no loss, with everyone's loved ones saved, along with all their possessions, just like God had promised. But on top of that, they also gained a lot of cattle and wealth from the Amalekites, where only 400 of the camel jockeys escaped. And then it talks about all the flocks and herds that were driven before the other livestock. And what it's saying there is that this is what they gained from the spoil from the Amalekites, that these flocks and herds, they weren't a part of their flocks and herds. And so they call this David's spoil. And it's not that David, that he's claiming all this wealth for himself, but that David, he is going to see to the distribution of all the spoil. And so now they return to the 200 men that were too weary to go, that they left at the brook Besor. And David, he separates himself from the 400 men and he goes out by himself to greet them. And he's very happy to see them. And so all 200, they all race over to the others to join in the celebration of joy, because this has been a tremendous victory. And they're so excited, they're happy to see all their wives and all their children. But then all the joy is quenched by a few worthless men called men of Belial in the King James Version, which means men of the devil. And what these worthless men are saying is because they did not go, that they don't get any of the spoil. In fact, they can't even have their own property back that we recovered. They can only have their wives and their kids back. And then they have to leave us. They have to leave our army. But they're wrong in what they're saying here, because they're making it sound like they did not go, like they had a choice. But that's not the truth. The truth is they could not go. It's not that they didn't want to go. They all wanted to go. They all wanted to share in that victory, but they were physically unable. They didn't have a choice here. And so you think, well, how did those 200 men, how did they respond to this accusation? They didn't say a word. They were silent, because really, what could you say? They never came out to the group and asking for any spoil. They only came out to celebrate in the victory.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,